the uncivil teacher of court etiquette, Kôtsuké no Suké. The iniquitous protagonist of this chapter is the uncivil courtier, Kira Kôtsuké no Suké, the fateful personage who brought about the degradation and death of the lord of the castle of Ako, yet refused to take his own life honorably when fitting vengeance so demanded. He was a man who merits the gratitude of all men, for he awakened priceless loyalties and provided the black yet necessary occasion for an immortal undertaking. 100 or more novels, scholarly articles, doctoral theses, and operas, not to mention effusions in porcelain, veined lapis lazuli, and lacquer, commemorate the deed. Even that most versatile of media, celluloid, has served to preserve the exploit, for Kushingura, or The Doctrinal History of the 47 Loyal Retainers, such is the title of the film, is the most oft-presented inspiration of Japanese filmmaking. The minutely detailed glory which those ardent tributes attest is more than justifiable. It is immediately just in anyone's view. I follow the story as told by A.B. Mitford, who omits those continual distractions lent by local color, preferring instead to focus on the movement of the glorious episode. That admirable lack of Orientalism allows one to suspect that he has taken his version directly from the Japanese. The United Ribbon. In the now faded spring of 1702, Asano Takumi no Kami, the illustrious lord of the castle of Ako, was obliged to receive an envoy from the emperor and offer the hospitality and entertainment of his home to him. 2,300 years of courtesy, some mythological, had brought the rituals of reception to a fine point of anguished complication. The ambassador represented the emperor, but did so by way of illusion, or symbolically, and this was a nuance which one emphasized too greatly or too little, only at one's peril. In order to avoid errors which might all too easily prove fatal, an official of the court at Yedo was sent beforehand to teach the proper ceremonies to be observed. Far from the comforts of the court, and sentenced to this backwoods villeggiatura, which, to him, must have seemed more like a banishment than a holiday, Kira Kôtsuké no Suké imparted his instructions most ungraciously. At times, the magisterial tone of his voice bordered on the insolent. His student, the lord of the castle of Ako, affected to ignore these affronts. He could find no suitable reply, and discipline forbade the slightest violence. One morning, however, the ribbon on the courtier's sock came untied, and he requested that the lord of the castle of Ako tie it up for him again. This gentleman did so humbly, yet with inward indignation. The uncivil teacher of court etiquette told him that he was truly incorrigible. Only an ill-bred country bumpkin was capable of tying a knot as clumsily as that. At these words, the lord of the castle of Ako drew his sword and slashed at the uncivil courtier, who fled, the graceful flourish of a delicate thread of blood upon his forehead. A few days later, the military court handed down its sentence against the attacker. The lord of the castle of Ako was to be allowed to commit harakiri. In the central courtyard of the castle of Ako, a dais was erected and covered in red felt, and to it the condemned man was led. He was given a short knife of gold and gems. He confessed his crime publicly. He allowed his upper garments to slip down to his girdle, so that he was naked to the waist, and he cut open his abdomen with the two ritual movements of the dirk. He died like a samurai. The more distant spectators saw no blood, for the felt was red. A white-haired man of great attention to detail, the councillor Oishi Kuranosuke, his second, decapitated his lord with a saber. The feigner of iniquities. Takumi no Kami's castle was confiscated, his family ruined and eclipsed, his name linked to execration. His retainers became ronins. One rumor has it that the same night the lord committed harakiri, 47 of these ronins met on the summit of a mountain, where, in minute detail, they planned the act that took place 1 year later. But the fact is that the retainers acted with well-justified delay, and at least one of their confabulations took place not on the difficult peak of a mountain, but in a chapel in a forest, an undistinguished pavilion of white-painted wood, unadorned save for the rectangular box that held a mirror. The Ronins hungered for revenge, but revenge must have seemed unattainable. Kira Kôtsuké no Suké, the hated teacher of court etiquette, had fortified his house, and a cloud of archers and swordsmen swarmed about his palanquin. Among his retinue were incorruptible, secret spies, upon whom no detail was lost, and no man did they so closely spy upon and follow as the counselor, Kuranosuke, the presumed leader of the avenging Ronins. But, by chance, Kuranosuke discovered the surveillance, and he based his plan for vengeance upon that knowledge. He moved to Kyoto, a city unparalleled throughout the empire for the color of its autumns. He allowed himself to descend into the depths of brothels, gambling dens, and taverns. In spite of the grey hairs on his head, he consorted with prostitutes and poets, and with persons even worse. Once he was expelled from a tavern, and woke up to find himself in the street, his head covered with vomit. It happened that a Satsuma man saw this, and said, sadly yet with anger, "Is this not Oishi Kuranosuke, who was a counselor to Asano Takumi no Kami, and who helped him to die, yet not having the heart to avenge his lord, gives himself up to women and wine? Faithless beast! Fool and craven! Unworthy the name of a samurai!" And he trod on Kuranosuke's face as he slept, and spat on him. When Kôtsuké no Suké's spies reported this specificity, the courtier felt much relieved. But things did not stop there. The counselor sent his wife and 2 younger children away, and bought a concubine. This iniquitous act cheered the heart and relaxed the fearful prudence of his enemy, who, at last, dismissed half his guards. On one of the bitter nights of the winter of 1703, the 47 Ronins met in an unkempt garden on the outskirts of Yedo, near a bridge and the playing card factory. They carried the pennants and banners of their lord. Before they began the assault, they informed the inhabitants of the city that they were not raiding the town, but embarking on a military mission of strict justice. The Scar. 2 groups attacked the palace of Kira Kôtsuké no Suké. The counselor, Kuranosuke, led the first, which assaulted the main gate. The second was led by the counselor's elder son, who was not yet 16 years old, and who died that night. History records the many moments of that extraordinarily lucid nightmare, the perilous, pendular descent of the rope ladders, the drum beating the signal of attack, the defenders' rush to defend, the archers posted on the rooftops, the unswerving path of the arrows toward vital organs, the porcelains dishonored by blood, the burning death that turns to ice, all the brazenly and disorderly elements of death. 9 of the Ronins died. The defenders were no less brave, and they would not surrender. Shortly after midnight, all resistance ended. Kira Kôtsuké no Suké, the ignominious cause of all that loyalty, was nowhere to be found. The attackers sought him through every corner of the emotion-torn palace. They were beginning to despair of finding him when the counselor noted that his bedclothes were still warm. Again the Ronins searched, and soon they discovered a narrow window hidden by a bronze mirror. Below, in a gloomy courtyard, a man in white looked up at them. A trembling sword was in his right hand. When they rushed down, the man gave himself up without a fight. His forehead bore a scar, the old rubric left by Tokami no Kami's blade. Then the bloody Ronins went down on their knees to the detested nobleman and told him that they were the former retainers of the lord of the castle of Ako, for whose death and perdition he was to blame, and they requested that he commit the suicide that befitted a samurai. In vain did the retainers propose to the lord's servile spirit that act of self-respect. He was a man impervious to the pleas of honor. At sunrise, the officers had to slit his throat. The evidence. Their thirst for revenge now quenched, but without wrath or agitation or regret, the Ronins made their way toward the temple that sheltered the remains of their lord. In a brass pail, they carried the incredible head of Kira Kôtsuké no Suké, and they took turns watching over it. They crossed fields and provinces to the honest light of day. Men blessed them and wept. The Prince of Sendai offered them his hospitality, but they replied that their lord had been waiting for them for almost 2 years. At last they reached the dark sepulchre, and they offered up the head of their enemy. The Supreme Court handed down his verdict, and it was as expected. The retainers were granted the privilege of suicide. All obeyed, some with ardent serenity, and they lie now beside their lord. Today, men and children come to the sepulchre of those faithful men to pray. The Satsuma Man. Among the pilgrims who come to the grave, there is one dusty, tired young man who must have come from a great distance. He prostrates himself before the monument to the councillor, Oishi Koranosuke, and he says aloud, "When I saw you lying drunk by the roadside at the doorstep of a whorehouse in Kyoto, I knew not that you were plotting to avenge your lord. And, thinking you to be a faithless man, I trampled on you and spat in your face as I passed. I have come to offer atonement." He spoke these words, and then committed harakiri. The priest of the temple where Koranosuke's body lay was greatly moved by the Satsuma man's courage, and he buried him by the side of the Ronins and their lord. This is the end of the story of the 47 loyal retainers, except that the story has no ending, because we, other men, who are perhaps not loyal, yet will never entirely lose the hope that we might one day be so, shall continue to honor them with our words.